Good morning. Glad you are able to join us this week. You can see that we're back inside the house. As warm as it was last week, it's supposed to be even warmer today. So we're back inside the house where it's at least a little bit cooler. This is Boba. His mama is out shopping today. So he is going to be in here with us and we'll let him just run around. Hopefully he will at least stay somewhat quiet as we're going through our lesson today. We are going to continue our lesson on the law. Now, the Old Testament law, the law that's found in the Hebrew Scriptures, that's the law that we're going to be looking at. But we're looking at it from the standpoint of how that plays out in the New Testament through Jesus' teachings and the teachings of his disciples. Therefore, we can know how to better live our lives and so that those lives will be pleasing to God. So if you remember, we talked about that the law has a purpose. God is in the process of trying to draw the nations back to himself. And he's going to do so by working through his followers. Now, he began working through a single individual, a man by the name of Abraham. And he entered into a covenant relationship with Abraham. And that covenant, just like any suzerain vassal covenant of the ancient times, had terms. Abraham would live his life in such a way that the nations, the world, would see his good works, glorify his God, and then his God would work through those good works to draw the nations to himself. And the good works were the terms of the covenant. So, Yahweh, Abraham's God, and Abraham enter into this covenant relationship. And now it is time for Abraham to live the terms of the covenant. Now remember, we talked about that Abraham was able to enter into the covenant for free. He got the invitation for free. Didn't cost him anything. He didn't have to change his life or anything. He was able to accept the invitation to the covenant free. Didn't cost him anything. But once he was in the covenant relationship, then it was necessary for him to start living out the terms of that covenant. And we said that the terms of the covenant, which are found in Genesis, were you must be circumcised, you must walk uprightly before God. Those were the terms of the covenant. Last week we looked at circumcision, a key part of the plan. Remember, Abraham was going to live his life in such a way that the nations would see his life and glorify his God. But that would only happen if the nations knew that he was in a covenant relationship with Yahweh in the first place. And circumcision was the outward expression, was the outward sign that I'm in the covenant relationship. Without that, Abraham's good works just bring him glory because he's just a good guy. He's just a great guy who does great works. Yahweh would never get the glory for it if the world doesn't understand that Abraham's good works, Abraham's life, is a result of this covenant. So circumcision was necessary. We looked at how Jesus in the New Testament also said there must be an outward sign or the plan doesn't work. But Jesus changed the sign to baptism. Now you can go back and look at last week's lesson series and you can see that the two signs actually say the same thing. Both of them tell the world who I am in a covenant relationship with so that that individual gets the glory. And so there's where you have Jesus saying, let your light shine before men so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. So baptism is the outward sign. Circumcision in the Old Testament, baptism in the New Testament. And we must, as followers of Jesus, we are required to let the world know that we are in this covenant relationship. But then you have to start asking, well, what are the good works? We're supposed to live our lives in such a way that the world, the nations, would see our good works, and that would give glory to the Father. The nations then would have a desire to be in that relationship with the Father. So what are those good works? Well, again, in the Old Testament, when God was speaking to Abraham, the good works were live uprightly, live blameless. Now, I do want to point out, and we've already said this once in a previous video, that did not mean that Yahweh expected his followers to live perfect lives. Upright and blameless did not mean perfect. Jesus in the New Testament did not expect his followers to live perfect lives, but he did expect us to be committed. And Yahweh in the Old Testament expected his followers to be committed. So if I'm committed to this covenant that I'm now in, I am committed to living out the terms of the covenant. So I need to know what the terms of that covenant are. Well, we can see the terms of the covenant in greater detail later on. Abraham has died, and his descendants have been multiplying over a period of about 600 years. And his descendants find themselves in Egypt. So if you remember the story of the 10 plagues and the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, and that entire event, if you remember that, that's what we're talking about. God is bringing his people, the descendants of Abraham, he's bringing them out of Egypt, and he takes them out into the desert to a place called Sinai, and there he gives them the terms of the covenant in greater specificity than just live uprightly and be blameless. He actually writes down some basic terms of this covenant. So if you've ever watched the old movie, The 10 Commandments, when Moses comes down off of the mountain and he has the 2 stones, the 2 tablets, the 2 tablets have the covenant written on them. So that the terms of the covenant are written on the stones. So Moses is bringing the terms of the covenant down, and Moses then reads the terms of the covenant to the people, and there's more involved in all that. But we can pick up this story in Exodus chapter 24, beginning in verse 3. It says, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. So these are the Lord's instructions. These are Yahweh's instructions. These are the rules. The rules were the terms of the covenant. And the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So the people had decided, yes, we will enter into this covenant relationship with Yahweh. We agree to the terms of the covenant. That's the same thing with us. When we enter into this covenant relationship with Yahweh through Jesus, we accept the terms of the covenant. So it's just as important for us to know the terms of the covenant as it was for them to know those terms. Where are the terms listed? Well, the terms are listed, they're listed in a few places, but the place that we're going to be looking at is Exodus chapter 20. So if you have your Bibles, you can start turning over there, Exodus chapter 20. I am going to read all the terms, then I'm going to talk very briefly about the groups of the terms. The terms can be divided into 2 groups. Exodus chapter 20, beginning of verse 1. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Those are the terms of the covenant. So if you've ever heard of the 10 Commandments, that's the 10 Commandments. If you've ever heard of the law, this is the basis of the law. Okay, these are the terms of the covenant. This is what Moses brought down and the people heard and agreed to. Now, I do want us to look at this. The terms of the covenant can actually be divided into two groups. The first group of terms are focused on how I interact with God. The second group is how I interact with other people. Both groups are important for the plan to be successful. For God to work through his followers, both group of terms are important to the plan. The world must see that I am in this covenant relationship with Yahweh and that I'm in it wholeheartedly. I'm all in. I'm committed. The world also must see how I relate with other people so that they can get an idea of how a covenant relationship with Yahweh is different than the way that the world lives. So, we need to look at both groups. Now today we're only going to look at the first group. Next week we can look at the second group. The first group would not have really surprised people in the ancient world. They were very accustomed to gods having rules, having stipulations on how their followers were to interact with them. Now, the things that Yahweh demanded may have seemed a little bit unusual, but the fact that Yahweh had certain rules, that would not have seemed unusual at all. The ancient gods regularly instructed their people on how to worship them, the gods. Gave them instructions on building temples and making idols and what kind of sacrifices to bring and all of those kinds of things. That was common in the ancient world. So having this group of rules that Yahweh gives to his people, saying this is how you interact with me, that would not have seemed unusual. The second group, though, the group of the terms that are specific for how I interact with other people, that would have been somewhat unusual. The gods in the ancient world didn't really seem to care that much about that. From archaeological research, we can see that the gods didn't get so involved in the personal life of the people. But Yahweh comes along and he says, I'm different. I do care how you interact with other people. Why? Because the plan depends on it. My plan of drawing the nations back to myself depends on the nations seeing how you interact with me and how you interact with other people. Therefore, both groups are critical to the success of the plan. So let's take a look at the first group first. And again, we will look at the second group next week. But the first group of the first grouping of terms we're going to look at this week. So, first off, you shall have no other gods before me. That is the first term of the covenant as it pertains to how we interact with God. We are not to have any other gods before Him. Now, what does that mean? Well, sometimes people have this idea that means, oh well, you can't have anything else in your life that would be a god to you. And that's really not, well, I guess it sort of depends on how you define God. But notice, I want you to notice, Yahweh did not say you cannot believe in other gods. Talking to his people, he just simply said, you cannot place any other gods ahead of me, before me. They cannot take that place of the superior God. I have to hold that place in your life. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, it means the same thing. It doesn't mean that we can't have things in our lives that, you know, if allowed to get out of control, could become a god to us. Money, power, those are not the things that are going to bring contentment in our lives. We've already talked about that. But there's nothing wrong with a person having money. That's not sinful. If that money, or going after that money, causes me to live a life that is in direct violation of Yahweh's instructions on how I'm to live, that then would be unacceptable to Him. Like I said, there are some groups that have taken this and, they don't celebrate Christmas, they don't celebrate birthdays, because, then you're just making that a god. Again, as long as whatever it is does not conflict with what God, Yahweh, instructs, it's fine. There is no prohibition to these other things. We simply cannot have anything that comes ahead of Yahweh. That's really what he is saying. But if a person wants to have a nice, fun weekend, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as that nice, fun weekend does not require that I live a life that is contrary to Yahweh's teachings, Yahweh's instructions of me. So that's the first instruction. Now, for God's people in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, that could be a problem in terms of other gods. You see, it would have been fine for the priest of another god to say, okay, the god X, whatever the god is, has decreed that everyone is to quit working on this particular day and observe an eclipse. Okay, well, as long as that does not conflict with what Yahweh was saying, it's fine. Observe the eclipse. Stop working and observe the eclipse. It's okay. Where it would get to be a problem for God's people is the worship of that God. Because the next term of the covenant says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God," and so forth. So you can read that. So again, there's nothing wrong with whatever the other gods might want you to do, as long as it doesn't conflict with what I tell you to do. But one of the things that I'm telling you to do is you can't make idols. Now, that would have been very limiting for God's people at the time, because the idols were how the followers interacted with their gods. You see, the idol served as the presence of the god. In fact, in the ancient world, they even had a process called the opening of the mouth process that basically instituted an idol as the presence of the god. The god would literally put his or her presence into that idol, so that the sun god, for instance, the sun god's presence would be up in the sky where the sun disk was, but the sun god's presence would also be associated with the idol. And this process of opening of the mouth, this process is how the god, in this case we're talking about the sun god, would be available to interact with his followers. So what is this process of opening of the mouth? Well, it's actually a fairly long process. We know about this process because we have found, I say we, I wasn't actually involved, but archaeology has found an Akkadian manuscript, tablet, that actually gives a description of what the opening of the mouth procedure was. It's composed of 3 steps. You had the purification, the vivification, and the enthronement. The purification was all about, okay, we're going to figure out what materials we're going to use, gold, silver, whatever the idol is going to be made of. We have to get that together. We also have to come up with a craftsman that was capable of doing the work on the idol. Everything had to be brought together so that the idol could be made. Even according to some archaeological evidence, the craftsman had to agree to publicly say that they actually did not make the idol, so that the god could give the credit for making the idol himself or herself. If the craftsman said, "Yes, I made that," well then, the god didn't make it. And so the craftsmen were many times had to agree that they would deny making the idol, so that the god or the goddess would get the glory. So all of that had to be brought in, everything had to be arranged. Then there was the vivification process. That is the actual process of bringing the idol to life. Through this process, the god would be given sensory powers associated with the idol, so that the god could sense the rituals, could sense the sacrifices, the food offerings, could actually enjoy the things that the followers were going to bring to the god. If the idol was not brought to life, the god would not really be able to sense this interaction with the followers. So bringing the god to life was important. In the Egyptian text, there's actually, the name is given to a particular tool that was involved in this process. It's called the Oddsy Blade. This really may have been the actual tool that is described in Exodus 32 in verse 4. If you remember the story, the children of Israel, they ask Aaron to make them an idol, and Aaron makes the golden calf. God is displeased with that entire process. The scripture says in Exodus 32:4, and he received, talking about Aaron, and he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made the golden calf. So the graving tool may have actually been the Oddsy Blade that Aaron may very well have been familiar with, being that he was from Egypt. So that may have been what the writer was actually talking about. But the idol itself had to be formed, it had to be brought to life, all of that had to take place. That's the vivification process. Then there's the enthronement process. This is the positioning of the idol into the temple or wherever it's going to be, so that the idol would be housed somewhere. So it could be in a temple, it could be in your home. There's a variety of places that idols might have been found. But this enthronement, it was the final step. At that point, the god literally would interact with his or her followers through that idol. Now, Yahweh is instructing his people, you can't do that. Not even for him. You can't make an idol of him. But you certainly can't make idols of other gods. The problem with that is, and why I said it was so limiting, is without an idol, you have no way of worshiping the God. So while it wouldn't be anything wrong with observing an eclipse because the God instructed the people to do that, as long as it didn't interfere with Yahweh's command, you could not worship other gods, because every other god was worshipped through the idols. And Yahweh said his people could not make idols, they could not set up idols. Now the question is, why? Well, there's probably a couple of reasons. One, it did prevent his people from worshiping other gods. But secondly, remember, God created humanity as his image. We were created to be his image that he interacted with. Therefore, there was no call for making any other image. Yahweh had already built his image. He had already formed his image in the person of humanity. So making another image of Yahweh was forbidden. You couldn't do that. This whole idea may very well have been what Paul was referring to in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 19, where he says, do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. See, this is that same idea. We are the temple that our God dwells in, not some idol. And Paul is using that exact same imagery that the people in Corinth that he's writing to, they would have understood. Yes, the God dwells in these idols. Yahweh, our God, dwells in us. We are his image. So our bodies are the temple. Therefore, this is where our bodies are where our God dwells. So we can see that God has said you cannot make idols. Therefore, the idea being you cannot worship other gods. For us in particular, that's pretty clear. We cannot make anything a god in our life. We can't make money a god in our life. We can't make power. We can't make anything, our possessions, nothing can be a god for us. Now, you also need to understand the culture behind this statement where Yahweh says you can't make idols. From a cultural standpoint, the people in the ancient world would have believed that that idol actually contained the presence of the God. By Yahweh saying you cannot have idols, He is also saying you cannot interact with these foreign, evil deities. That's something that applies for us as well. You see, just like in the ancient world, the idea that these, I'm going to say divine, and when I say divine, I'm talking supernatural. I'm not saying that they are wonderful, divine in that regard. But these supernatural, divine beings were thought to actually dwell inside these idols. Folks, for us today, there's all kinds of entities, divine, supernatural entities, that are associated with things that are sinful. God is in essence telling us the same thing. You cannot be associated with these sinful things that are tied to these demonic presences. Now, a lot of times in the church today, you start talking about demonic presence, and a lot of people say, oh, that stuff doesn't exist, the supernatural, all of that kind of stuff, that's not. And it never ceases to amaze me that those same people that say that will talk about the virgin birth without blinking an eye. Jesus being born of a virgin doesn't seem unusual at all. But then you start talking about demonic presences being associated with sinful activities, things on the internet, and how when we look at those things or we participate in those things, we are bringing a demonic presence into our presence, into our home, into our workplace, whatever. All too often people say, oh, no, that doesn't. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but that is the same basic idea that God is trying to get across here. You have to stay away from, God telling us, you have to stay away from these things that have these demonic presences associated with them. There's tons of stuff online that when we open it up, when we start bringing that kind of material into our homes, into our lives, the demonic presence just comes right along with it. So we can see that God says, you cannot have any other gods before me. And He also says you cannot make idols. You cannot have idols in your life. The next one that God says is, you cannot take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Now, all too often in Christianity we have thought that this is saying, well, that's where it says you can't use cuss words, you can't use curse words. That's really not what God is saying. What we need to keep in mind is the Hebrew word that is translated vain or vanity really means worthless or empty, or like empty speech or worthless speech or a falsehood. What God is saying is, you cannot use my name falsely. You got to keep in mind, again, this is written to the ancient world. When two individuals would enter into a covenant relationship, they would call on their gods to enforce the terms of the covenant. So you might have two individuals, two people. Person one is going to give person two seed for crops. So this first person is going to give this person some seeds so that this person can plant the crops. And this person is then going to give this person some of the harvest as payment. Well, they would enter into an agreement, a contract, that's what they would both agree to. I will give you seed, you will give me part of the harvest. And the gods would be called on to do that, to enforce that covenant. No one in their right mind who, at the time, who believed in the gods would ever go back on a covenant agreement like that, because who knows what the God would do to you. But there were some unscrupulous characters that didn't really believe in the gods, didn't really follow the gods. Even in the ancient world, we have writings from the ancient text where people, they just use the idea of gods for control, to manipulate people. We know that is true. Well, that means you could enter into a covenant relationship. I will give you seed, you will give me part of the harvest. If this person doesn't really care about the gods anyway, this person could take the seed, plant the crops, and then just keep it all for himself. Now, he's going to pretend like, I'm going to call on my God to hold me accountable and all of that kind of stuff, but he really has no intention of carrying through his part of the covenant. This is the kind of thing that God is talking about. You do not bring me into covenant agreements falsely. You don't bring me into this kind of thing just so that you can get the upper hand in an agreement. Again, folks, it goes back to the plan. If this person brought Yahweh into the covenant arrangement to hold everyone accountable, and then this person just backs out, it makes his God look bad. And the whole plan is we make God look good. And so God says, you do not bring me into these covenant relationships when you have no intentions of fulfilling your terms of the covenant anyway. In fact, another way of looking at this is, you don't bring me into anything where it's just to build your own vanity, build yourself up. If it's just something so that you can be benefited, so that you can come out on top, you don't bring me into it at all. Because again, that is not what the world is looking for. The world is not looking for some religion that is based on, I am going to come out on top all the time. I am setting everything up so that I can be the winner all the time. That's not what the world is looking for. The world is looking for justice. It's looking for peace. It's looking for contentment. That's what the world is looking for. And God, in essence, says, you don't bring me into stuff where you are just going to, you're just establishing a covenant just so that you can get what you want in life. That is, in essence, what it means. You are not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain. The last one is, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, in this command, God is in essence reminding his people of their position in the relationship. You are my imager. Remember, you can go back to the first video where God talks about we are imagers of him. God is giving us a weekly reminder that we are His imager. We image Him. And He says, just like He worked 6 days and rested on the seventh, we are to work 6 days and rest on the seventh. Now, that actually has several purposes. One, there's been all kinds of studies done that show that if you work people 7 days a week, 7 days a week, 7 days a week, you just keep doing that, productivity will go up for a while, but eventually productivity begins to drop even to a level that is lower than if you work people 6 days a week and give them a day off, and 6 days a week and give them a day off, 6 days a week and give them a day off. They will have a higher productivity in that kind of 6 days on, 1 day off, 6 days on, 1 day off. They'll have a higher productivity if people work like that than if they work 7 days a week, week after week after week. Again, they'll start off with higher productivity working 7 days a week, but eventually they will drop down so that they become even less productive than if they just work 6 days a week. So first off, it's just to our benefit. Secondly, folks, we need to be reminded. There needs to be a weekly reminder. Every time I take a day off, I need to be reminded. I'm God's imager. I'm supposed to live a life to image Him. So what God has given us is this weekly reminder. Our role as His imager is so important that He has a built-in reminder for us. If we don't think about that on our day that we rest, if that's not what we're thinking about, then the day off is not serving its total function, because it should be that reminder to us. It is also tells us a little bit about how much we value God and His gifts. Folks, can you imagine a life where you don't get a day off? You work every day of every week, of every month, of every year, from the day that you start working until the day that you die. And there are no days off. I mean, can you imagine a life like that? Well, a day off every week is a gift that God has given us. What do we do with that gift? Well, if I value God, then I value His gift. Can you imagine giving your child a valuable gift, and your child sells the gift so that he or she can just buy illegal drugs? I mean, that is in essence what we're doing when we make the decision, I would rather work and make more money than take a day off. Why? Because money's more important than the day off. But just that simple. Now, what does that mean for people who have to work on Sunday? Well, first off, keep in mind, it doesn't say Sunday, it says the Sabbath, and technically Saturday is the Sabbath. But that really isn't even what is so important anyway. What God is in essence saying is, you need to take a day off. I'm giving you this gift. Use the gift. It's to your benefit to use the gift. It reminds you on a regular basis of your position in the covenant. It reminds you that you are an imager of me. Are there people that have to work 7 days a week sometimes? Certainly. And it's not sinful if your job requires you to work on Sunday, or if your job requires you to work 7 days a week from time to time. That's not sinful. But it is important that we take this gift seriously. God gave it to us. and we need to be serious about the gift because it does serve a purpose. It tells the world, first off, who our God is, and it also reminds us who our God is so that we don't stray from the covenant that He has given to us. So, what can we learn from these? Well, as stated earlier, these covenant terms are tied to our relationship to God. These are the vassal requirements. When I enter into this covenant relationship, I am accepting the terms of the covenant. For us today, when we enter into the covenant relationship, the Holy Spirit takes residence inside of us. We are the temple. We are the image that He takes residence in. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that we live our lives according to how He would have us live them. We need to treasure His gifts. We need to lean on Him. We need to find comfort in Him. This is all what these first terms are talking about. I'm your God. You take comfort in that. I will be your God in every sense of the word. I will provide protection. I will provide resources that you need. I will provide all of those things. And you lean on me. Don't go out into the world and go after all of these other things that you may think are going to benefit you, but they're not. Lean on me. Take comfort in me is what God is in essence saying. Enjoy the relationship that you have with me. The next group that we're going to be looking at next week is how I interact with other people. Today's lesson is how I interact with God. That's the first part of the law, is my interaction with God. So we will continue this next week. So take some time this week and just think about how I can better interact with God, how I can have a closer relationship with Him. What areas of my life do I have a tendency to, sometimes I put these other things ahead of my relationship with God. How do I keep myself from being drawn to these other things? These are all things that God is asking us to do as we participate in this covenant relationship, that He becomes more and more important. And these other things out in the world that our flesh desires, we have a desire for these things, we push more and more of those things aside and we draw closer and closer to Him. That is the first part of the law. I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you back next week.